Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Marlena Ichon, CRO, and with me, as always, is Tim Anaya, Vice President of Marketing and Communications. So, Tim, there was a lot of hoopla, but if you didn't know, fellow Californians, it was actually inaugural day in the state last Friday. Governor Newsom was sworn in again for the second term. And of course, we got to talk about the speech. So listeners might remember the governor visited Florida promoting his freedom theme. And believe it or not, folks, he said that California was more free than Florida. That's what, according to the governor. So the media and a lot of political observers thought that this was his way of dipping his toes for a presidential bid. But we're former speechwriters, communications professionals. So we want to take a look at this more from that lens. So what did you think of his talk?
Well, I was struck by a couple of things. First, all the pageantry of it. He of course picked Friday, which was the annual anniversary of January 6th, to kind of play up on that. We, the people, are standing against those who are fighting our democracy, and we're standing for democracy here. And they even had a march from the Tower Bridge, which for those of you who aren't familiar with Sacramento, it's a grid. So there's a bridge, the Tower Bridge between Sacramento and West Sacramento, and then you walk up Capitol Mall to the Capitol. He had a march picture, the civil rights marches on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. That's clearly what he was going for. He didn't even walk the whole way. Astonishingly, they kept reporters at bay who were trying to ask him questions during the march, and including one reporter who was asked, what are you doing here? He's like, I'm trying to do my job. He walked like half the way and then got in his motorcade and went off to the inaugural. So didn't even walk all the way to the Capitol, his supposed march. The other thing that I was struck by, inauguration speeches, like a State of the State, this is hopeful, optimistic. This is your vision for the coming year. It necessarily should be a uniting, positive, hopeful address of what your ideal would be over the next 4 years. And I was just struck how kind of angry and combative and partisan and negative that speech was. And, I think after listening to that, I don't think we are set up for a good 4 years ahead. If this is the high water mark, we're in for a very dark partisan 4 years in his second term.
I'm glad you brought up all that conservative bashing, Tim. I mean, he's clearly eyeing for a presidential bid because there's no reason for him to bash conservatives here in the state. The Democrats and the unions have much of the power. Obviously it was a bigger message to the progressives in the country. And he's really doubling down on the hard left. I think he ought to be reminded that that's not what's going to get him elected. Biden was elected because he wasn't Donald Trump, and he characterized himself as a moderate, bringing Washington back to normal, reaching out. Of course, that didn't happen. It turned out that he was totally co-opted by the left, extreme left in his party, and his poll ratings are dismal. California is off the chart left in this country, and I don't think that Democrats in the South and Midwest would want to look like California. I don't think this message is appealing.
Well, certainly his talk of California being the, quote, freedom state notwithstanding. The other thing, too, I think you're right on that issue of, obviously this address was his effort to set himself up nationally. And one thing that I think is interesting about Gavin Newsom, he has been kind of and I don't mean this in a negative partisan way, he has been kind of a chameleon politically. He started out, he was a moderate, pro-business city supervisor and mayor of San Francisco. Even when he was lieutenant governor, he was talking about his small business agenda and his economic development agenda. And he's just kind of morphed that into, certainly from the time of the gay marriage episode in San Francisco and during his time as governor, to be, kind of an activist, liberal crusader, putting his thumb in the eye of conservatives across the country. Yes, he can position himself. He can be all things to all people. But I think most people outside of California, those who aren't familiar with Gavin Newsom or what he's been up to, I think the more that they will learn about him, I don't know that kind of hot air is going to sell. It comes across as very insincere. It makes people question, well, what do you really stand for? Do you have any principles? Are you really just trying to be all things to all people? And, his rhetoric in his speech on Friday, it was the further proof of that, this was all about his rhetoric and style and symbolism of the moment, very little about kind of heartfelt principles.
Well, Tim, I think you're right about that, because when I first started getting involved with PRI, I don't think I actually worked for PRI yet at the time. Gavin Newsom was invited to give a luncheon talk for PRI, and he talked about small business and the need to unburden them with regulation. He also talked about the homeless problem and the drug problem in the city. And when he was elected, I thought it was a new day for the city. I thought it was a new day for San Francisco. And if anything, he just lunged himself left, and it's been very disappointing. But in that speech, I was convinced that, there was going to be a better future for the city.
So then it brings up the takeaway from the speech that many are guffawing about, and that is his discussion of California is the freedom state, which is just laughable on so many levels. What did you think of that as kind of a highlight message for his speech?
This freedom agenda, this freedom theme is so closely branded and tied to libertarians and conservatives, I would say for decades now, Tim. So to use that term seems to me almost professional malpractice, sort of like taking the Nike swoosh and turning it upside down and think you're going to sell sneakers. I think even liberals and progressives would be confused by this kind of messaging. Of course, our Kerry Jackson, who just really went to town on the theme, the piece that he wrote over the weekend. So I got to believe that for progressives, I wonder if they're thinking, what's this about? Progressives, liberals have always been willing to give up a little of the rough and tumble of democratic capitalism in exchange for more security, more government, more control. That's why we have Obamacare and the laws that we have here in California. So I think that this theme isn't going to fly. It's confusing to liberals and progressives, and it shows that he doesn't have good political instincts. Like, who are the people around him who are advising him on this freedom theme? It just seems odd and misplaced to me. And I wonder if it could be the downfall of his presidential bid.
Well, when we're talking too about Gavin going national, as we've documented at PRI with our California migrating study, we've had many, many people and businesses leaving the state. We just got further confirmation of that at the end of the year, that the out-migration problem has grown for 3 years in a row. Well, not all of those people leaving are Republicans. There are a lot of Democrats who used to live in California who moved to Missouri or Texas or Florida. And while they may want to bring more liberal values to those states, one thing that they don't want is the kind of government control that we have in California. So I don't know that is really a message that is going to resonate. I think, as you say, I don't know that real progressive voters, they're not really into more freedom. They want more government control. They want government putting their thumb on the scale in a whole host of things, and they don't mind that when government gets involved. It certainly is not going to sway moderate and conservative voters.
So maybe you should move on to our podcast, because it's a little bit longer than the usual. It's a recorded talk from a dinner we had in Los Angeles with speaker Kiron Skinner. So listeners might remember that Dr. Skinner was on President Trump's national security team. She was at the State Department. Now she's with the Pepperdine School of Public Policy. And before that, she was at Hoover. She was a senior fellow for many years. She's also a Reagan scholar and wrote several great books on the Reagan presidency. And I think our listeners really enjoy this. Professor Skinner's talk is going to be on the current national security threats facing our nation. But before that, I wanted to just say that, speaking of national security, we just posted on our website our next speaker, which is Gordon Chang, one of the country's leading experts on China. Folks, he's coming all the way from back east to give a talk for PRI at the Pacific Club in Newport Beach. So the luncheon is January 31st, and all the details to sign up be on our website at pacificresearch.org. And he's organizing his Sacramento conference in February. So Tim, you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes, we have our annual California Ideas in Action Conference is Wednesday, February 15th at the Sutter Club here in downtown Sacramento. And the theme of our conference is going to be exploring the work of our Free Cities Center, which aims to bring free market ideas to really turn around our big kind of failing cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco, and also bring a renewed quality of life and vibrancy to our inner cities. So we have keynote luncheon speaker is Keith Knopf, who's the president and CEO of the Raley's Company, which is the big grocery store chain here in Northern California. And we also have Michael Schellenberger, the famous or maybe infamous Michael Schellenberger is our going to give closing remarks. You may remember him from his book, San Francisco, and certainly he is one who draws interest and attention with everything that he's working on. So for those of you who are interested in coming, we'd love to have you. And registration is, we're getting a lot of interest. So be sure to RSVP today at pacificresearch.org/events to guarantee your spot there.
Yeah, there's no charge for the conference. Thank you, Tim, for that. And let's just go right to Professor Kiron Skinner. Thanks all for listening.
I'm supposed to talk about foreign policy and hotspots. I'll pick a few. Everyone wants to hear about China, but I'd like to start with the Western Hemisphere. We used to call it our backyard, but I actually think there are partners, and I don't think there is a really viable future for the United States without a better set of relationships in the Western Hemisphere. So I'll start there. We're facing, I think, a dilemma in the region that we've never faced before. In the 70s and 80s, and especially during the Reagan years, the big problem was military dictatorships. And how do we deal with military dictatorships in Latin America and regimes that we don't like? Now we're facing something that's almost universal across Latin America. I know Brazil doesn't exactly call itself that, but just for this conversation, and the Caribbean. Socialist governments that are democratically elected, except for a handful. And we're to the point now, after the outcome in the Brazilian election, the recent election in Colombia, and a handful of other countries, that Guatemala is our best friend. And as I like to say, when you're relying on Guatemala for Western defense in the Western Hemisphere, you have a problem. They're good friends and they're trying. So the challenge and no one's talking about this, Donald Trump tried to, but never really was able to develop a Western Hem policy, largely because his political appointees joined forces with career officials and blocked him. He was the one that said, let's get rid of Maduro and we can have a shot in the region. The president today of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, then Bolsonaro's gone. I've mentioned Colombia. That election did not go the way that we had wanted. There's just not much left. And I think the big challenge for us is how do we, in this environment with democratically elected socialist governments, have a Western Hemisphere policy? These are the governments that we have. And even if a president or two loses office, he or she will have so baked in the policies through the legislature that are so socialist in orientation that it will be hard for a more representative leader in 1 or 2 terms to reverse the outcomes. This is the new Americas. And so I'm really worried about it, and I don't think that we have a possibility of a serious strategy for the Western Hemisphere coming out of our State Department, because this is the Western Hemisphere that they want. In 2016, when polled, and those who responded, employees, civil servants of the State Department, at least 85% voted for Hillary Clinton. I think the number was higher for Joe Biden in 2020. When you have a permanent government that is progressive in nature and wants certain outcomes, it doesn't matter if you have a Republican administration, a conservative president. They win, you lose. And I think that was a big lesson for those of us who served in the Trump administration. We were minorities in the federal government. And I say to many of my colleagues, many of whom I'm still close with, we're working on projects together now. Some of us were already minorities in the US, but they were for the first time minorities in their life. And it's really hard in the federal government when you're a teeny minority against a federal machine that has certain preferences. And I think that has contributed to the Western Hemisphere that we now have. Why is it this way? Meanwhile, China is moved into the hemisphere, and so has Russia. You could say we could compete more with the Chinese and Russians. That would be a start, given the realities of the governments that we have. But it's hard for us to compete with China in the region because our U.S. Agency for International Development, our State Department, and other parts of the federal government have all kinds of political, social engineering ties to foreign assistance. And the Chinese have none. They could care less about regime type, they could care less about human rights, but we have ESG requirements, we have DEI requirements, we have support abortion requirements, we have transgender support requirements for USAID. No wonder we're losing right in our former backyard. I think this is a national security crisis that doesn't get talked about very much. It's not about nuclear weapons, it's not about the war in Ukraine, but it's about the future of the Americas. And that is something that I think a conservative Republican administration will address day one. Trump, again, wanted to do it, but had almost no support among his political appointees to address the Maduro problem, which I think would have sent a big signal in the region that socialism wasn't welcome. Why this also matters in a geopolitical sense beyond the U.S. is that as Russia is failing in a stalemated war in Ukraine, Putin's larger vision of a global socialist world is really taking place in this very region as he places troops in Nicaragua and has activities going on that we even don't know about. And so I think socialism isn't dead. It's growing near us. And in that way, Russia, even if it's defeated in this war, has a bulwark and a strength right next to us. But since I've talked about all these odd requirements for foreign assistance, let me turn to the Ukraine war, where I think that is also happening. Well before Russia invaded Ukraine, nations in the region were beginning, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, to figure out that they had to do something to protect themselves. First, they turned to China, and in 2012, China signed what was called the 17+1 agreement with 12 Central and Eastern European nations plus China, something like a Belt and Road initiative. And a few years later, the Baltic states said, this isn't working for us. And they started a counter called the 3 Cs Initiative, which now has 12 European Union nations that are working on energy, security, trade, economic development, together with the U.S. as a partner. The Trump administration put billions of dollars into 3 Cs. And without it, I think the countries would be less prepared for this war right now. But why in the Biden administration would they not embrace this initiative of European self-sufficiency? One of the big problems is ESG. That these countries are not living up to environmental, social, and governance requirements that some unelected bureaucrats, not in Brussels, but in the U.S. State Department, burrowed down in the basement, who believe that these countries don't have enough political representation, don't support the policies that they care about, and are generally racist because they don't want immigrants from North Africa, the Middle East, and Turkey flooding into their countries. So 3Cs is now underfunded, though the U.S. was a big underwriter for that. Community and groupings of states that would bring states from the Adriatic Seas to the Baltic region to the Black Sea together in an unprecedented grouping of nations that cross NATO and the European Union. This is just the beginning. We have a social engineering foreign policy in this administration, but I don't blame it on the Biden administration. Again, I turn to the permanent bureaucracy, those in government who over many decades believe that you have to make the rest of the world like the America that you actually want to have, not the one that actually exists. So that's part of the story, I think, of what's happening in Europe. I think Europe would be doing better in its fight in the war in Ukraine if it wasn't also fighting the social justice war that it's facing in the United States. But even with those pressures, I think it's been doing an incredible job of what Trump talked about with burden sharing. And speaking of burden sharing, and I said this back in September when I spoke at the Bay Area, and it's been a tagline I've had for a long time. When Trump campaigned in 2016, he talked about the fact that only 29 members then of NATO, now they're 30, 4 or 5 were putting 2% of GDP toward defense. And that was the pledge that had been made. And he said, you have to do better. By the time he left office, about 10 nations were meeting that pledge, and hundreds of billions of dollars more into NATO defense. The war in Ukraine would not be where it is without the commitment that the NATO countries made during those hard years of the Trump administration, where he was questioning aloud whether he was committed to Article 5. You may or may not like Trump and his rhetoric. I have real problems with it. I served in the administration. I watch what it does downstream in the bureaucracy when you've got a president thinking aloud every day about things he should keep to himself. But the fact of the matter is the Europeans got scared straight. And they're able to fight this war and provide mutual defense today because of what happened just a few years ago. And they're doing more in terms of R&D and technology advancement and cooperation in Europe. This war is rewriting the map of Europe, and the U.S. is part of it, and I think the Trump administration is a big factor as well. I've mentioned NATO and defense. We gave the Europeans some breathing room by not having a woke foreign policy that required them to pay for transgender medical services, which our U.S. State Department and USAID are requiring for not only our employees abroad, but our partners abroad. So we weren't doing all of that. We weren't perfect. I'm the first to say it. But we gave our partners and allies some breathing room away from our social policies to focus on infrastructure, manufacturing, and defense. And that's the backstory of this war. And that's what I think Vladimir Putin hadn't calculated on, that the West is stronger and healthier than he thought it actually was. Partly because the rhetoric of Trump was so confusing, you couldn't sort out signal from noise. Thank God he could not. So you can clap if you like, but that's what I think really is a big part of it. But when you look at what's happening with Europe, things that in January of this year, February, March, and April weren't possible are now the new norm. NATO expanding to the high north. Finland and Sweden, no possibility just 6 or 9 months ago. Now it will happen. That's the biggest, I think, threat for Russia in all of this, because within a stone's throw of Russian territory, you have not two new NATO members, but highly mechanized NATO members. really excellent at both conventional warfare and cybersecurity. And they know the language and the culture. That is a huge threat that's not being talked about as much for Russia. If there's anything that good comes out of war, war is never great. But in this case, I think that the rewriting of the European map is fundamental. Then you have the possibility of Ukraine and Moldova joining the European Union. That wasn't even a possibility 6 months ago. All of these impossibilities are now the new norm. And we saw in Ukraine, and we see it every day, a country that is ground zero for Western security, Western freedom, and we understand what it looks like to defend yourself against a huge global bully. I think the Ukrainians have done remarkable work. Now, there's a debate in the U.S. on the left and right where they're meeting in the same place that we shouldn't be funding this war. We should get out of the war. We have no interest. So you've got Marjorie Taylor Greene on one side and her opponents on the other side saying some of the same things. I see what they're saying about our own domestic problems, but whether you like it or not, the freedom of Ukraine is connected to our own freedom and our own security. And they're not asking that much. No one's asked us to fight. They've asked us to spend money. And we're not coming close to what we spent in Afghanistan and Iraq, and I don't think the American public will allow it. So I think it's a worthy investment. I think it's a war we don't want to happen again, but I do think that the wokeism in U.S. foreign policy, the turning on the spigot of the Nord Stream 2 early on in this administration, set the conditions for Vladimir Putin to expand his empire. And I find very few people who disagree in the foreign policy community with that fact on the left and the right. So this is the world we're in. We've got in our own hemisphere a set of regimes that we have to deal with, but we want to lecture to them instead of accepting who they are. We want them to rewrite their constitutions to support our social engineering, but they won't. So we're generally at a stalemate. We've got a Europe that's taking more agency and it's leading the West. I think the West is moving again after having stalemated for a while. And then we have the problem of China, which until Donald Trump, there was no consensus that China's a problem. But I think recognizing that China's a problem is part of the problem because it's an easy way out to yell and scream about China and call it names. It has nothing to do with changing our China strategy and developing a China policy for the 21st century. We don't have one. Trump addressed the issue of tariffs, but he never got around to having his State Department rewrite the regional strategy for China that would have put all of our bureaus and the interagency in sync in a pro-West direction. I challenge anyone to tell me what the China policy is beyond saying China is a problem. Everyone identifies the bipartisan community in Washington, the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, which is now an acronym, like the NSF or the NSA. Everyone knows about the CCP. But I actually think the CCP is not our biggest problem. It's the Chinese Communist Party. Yes, it's powerful. Yes, it does nefarious things to its people and all over the world. And so we've been kind of thinking out loud if we could just get rid of the CCP. Why would we want to do that? It was the Soviet Communist Party that ultimately brought down the Soviet Union. Perhaps we want to think a little bit more broadly about China. The CCP in power could be our greatest asset, like what happened in the Soviet Union in its final days. As party members turned on each other, they did the work that we could not do. Trying to develop relationships with defectors and those in leadership who just no longer believe in the ideology is worthwhile. One of the ways that we're keeping the Chinese Communist Party in power is by saying, we hate it, it'll be out in 3 years, let's just sit back and wait. The Chinese have such deep relationships throughout the U.S. It's hard to get a China policy that speaks to the larger China problem without seeming like you are woke or racist or don't really care about a billion people. The Chinese have a major stronghold in U.S. universities. They fund them. They send thousands and thousands of students. They fund many of the think tanks in Washington. They have cultural centers everywhere. And they have the opportunity to call any American leader racist who does not, who attacks them. And that stops many people from saying anything. If I'm worried about China, it's not that China's the problem. I'm worried about our response. This is a threat that we've never seen in U.S. history. We've had our most recent one, the Soviet Union. But by comparison, that was a fight in the Western family, almost. And this is not. This is a very different culture, a different language, a country that has, a nation that has imperial ambitions that the Soviet Union never had and could not contemplate. It has a global ambition to reorder the international system. No one could say that the Soviet Union was attempting to reorder the international system. It was happy if it could hold on to the Warsaw Pact countries in its own region. And it meddled around the world, but not at the level, for example, on the African continent, of the Chinese. It had nothing as ambitious as the Silk Road Initiative, and it could barely survive. It was a country with nuclear weapons, a big red army, but a backwards nation. China is in every part of the globe, almost every nation in the world, and it's fully infiltrated all of the societal and cultural institutions of the United States. That, to me, is something that leaders on both sides should be talking about, but they dare not. They talk about the CCP. Get rid of it, and it's a new world. I don't think that begins to help us understand. Plus, we have the issue of not having language and culture experts in our federal government. Enough people who speak Mandarin, who have spent time in China beyond Hong Kong on vacation. So every other person now is a China expert, but they know very little about the nation of which they claim to understand. These are problems that I think are plaguing the U.S. and the world. But I do think that there's hope, and some of it's happening organically, and even with us. So we can't really name the problem in China yet, but we have done things in the Indo-Pacific, and a lot of this happened under the Obama administration, and then under Trump, and now expanded under Biden. For example, the Quad, the nations of India, Japan, Australia, and the U.S. It started at a kind of working level, then it elevated under Trump, and now under Biden it's at the leaders level. That grouping, not perfect. India is highly independent and probably the most important nation we need to watch in Asia. If you persuade India to your side, you get a Nobel Prize. It's almost impossible to do. They're pretty crafty. They're very neutral. They're very independent, and they're always calculating. But they are active members of the Quad. At the policy school at Pepperdine, we will hold a Quad meeting in January with cyber experts to talk about how we counter China in the cyber realm. That set of relationships and that model, it's not NATO, doesn't have an office building, doesn't have a bureaucracy, but these smaller groupings of nations in partnerships, not really formal alliances, I think are glimmers of hope, and they happen organically, and the U.S. is a full participant. I've already mentioned the 3 Cs in Europe. Unbelievable, no one knows about it, but another organic grouping. I think we need more of those. We need one in Latin America, and some of us are trying to think of what that would look like. The expansion of NATO, all of these are organic instances of partnerships. And I think that will be the saving grace for us. But I think we need a lot more. And I've said before, I may have said this in the prior speech, our biggest national security threat is our K through 16 problem. None of this can be addressed without re-entering into the curriculum, and Governor Wilson and I were talking about this with others before we sat down for dinner. Basic economics, military history, U.S. history, diplomatic history, American history into the curriculum. You can go K through 16 in the U.S., even at some elite institutions where your parents pay a lot of money for you to go to these institutions with very little understanding of what I just said. Then those young people go to work on the Hill, because only young people can work in those staff jobs on the Hill, long hours, no pay, and group housing. I can't do that anymore. Long hours, you end up writing legislation, and you can't defend the West because you've never heard of it in the first place. But more importantly, some of those people go on to be elected members of office at state and local and national level. They face the same problem. I think we saw the beginning of that problem when Senator Barack Obama became president of the United States. You had the first generation of people who, including my generation, same generation, who had the traditional Western curriculum removed from the curriculum. And that's what legislation looks like, that's what leadership looks like. And the goal in this new project is to dismantle the West. It's not they're not even shy about making that argument. It makes those handful of institutions that we have left that are committed to the survival of the West and the American project more important now than they've ever been at any point in their history. That's the reason I joined the faculty of Pepperdine. Despite the fact that 22 years in the industrial Midwest, I realized it was time for warmer weather, and I'm glad to be home. But there was a deeper intellectual reason. But I say all these things not to be despondent or to be negative or to think there's no pathway forward. I do believe that we're still the world's best bet. We still have the best economy. We are watching and supporting a new Europe that is emerging. Not that it's perfect. We're learning about food insecurity in ways that many of us never understood. And Russia's backing down. Example, the grain deal that will allow Ukrainian grain out of the region, especially to Africa and other parts of the world. But the West is on the move. And it's on the move largely because our core ally, the Europeans, they've decided to take bigger agency than they ever have, or at least in a half century. And they're defending themselves. We have some core debates. Their version of nationalism is very different than ours. I was just last week in Ukraine meeting with President Orban and the defense minister of that country, and in Poland and the leadership there. And I came away with thinking what I already really understood. We're evaluating them and their nationalism through our own American social project prism. They're trying to survive. Hungary was once this big, now it's this big. Poland was once this big, now it's this big. Every time there is a war, they lose territory. They lose sovereignty. They get rewritten by outside forces. When they say they don't want to be involved in the Ukraine war, is that they don't want to be this big. And we don't know anything about that. 9/11 was devastating. Pearl Harbor was devastating. But we didn't lose territory. We didn't lose identity. We didn't lose knowing that that town is now in Slovenia, but it used to be under your grandparents in your country, and those people speak your language. I think we have to stop lecturing and understand better who people are, who our allies are, and what they can do for our future. I could say a lot more, but I'm looking at Sally, and it's dangerous to let me talk. But I'd love to be able to take questions if there's an opportunity, and answer any questions that I can answer. And I'm just really glad to be here and be with you.
What about North Korea? I mean, when you hear that,
Right.
he's testing these ballistic missiles, I mean, we're on the West Coast. Are they going to hit us? I mean, is this just...
So I didn't mention every hotspot
No,
in the
you
world.
couldn't. No,
They're
of course you can't.
Iran, North Korea, those are, and not to just be, to say that everything we did in the Trump administration was right, because a lot of times we were flying blind. But, the dictators around the world were kind of in the box under Trump, largely because they didn't know what he would do next, and he liked to think aloud. And often his thoughts aloud weren't the prettiest thoughts, but it kept them contained. And I think when you're dealing with really bad actors in the world, you can't be nice. Just like when the Blinken leadership team went early on to meet with the Chinese and say we want to work together, and then they got lectured about how bad we are on social justice issues. I think you have to start tough, and you have to say stay tough. I think in some ways that was the essence of Reagan. But Reagan was more unique and more successful than Trump in the sense that his idea of peace through strength was really one where he would talk tough, but he was always willing to cooperate and negotiate. And he never disrespected people, but they understood the firm resolve with which he spoke. I think that's a lot of the story of North Korea right now. There's just no restraint on them. And in fact, we want to cooperate. We want to understand what their challenges are. Their challenges are they need to denuclearize. That's the challenge that they have. That was the Trump conversation. I think they would have got closer. Iran, Syria, some of the biggest tragedies on earth, I think now. And it's a longer conversation. And I'm one of the skeptics about the maximum pressure campaign. I don't think it pressured. It was impossible to get all of the globe to go down to zero on Iranian oil. Iran kept living another day, which suggests that they were getting oil. And I have questions about the wisdom of killing Soleimani. Not that he was a great guy, of course he was not, but he had the militias under control in the region. They've gone wild. There's no one at that level who can control them, especially in Iraq, Syria, and other places. These are all tragedies that are connected to what happens in Washington. And, we've let the Iranian people down many, many times, and I think we are doing it again.
So if China were to invade Taiwan, which is a big question, would Japan get involved in helping the Taiwanese? And I know the U.S., but I'd like to hear your perspective on that.
Well, I'm of the school of thought that China's not about to invade Taiwan. It's looking at the Ukraine war and thinking, look how the globe has organized against Russia. Its junior partner, its co-conspirator in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, where they've tried to pick up much of the countries of the global south. That whole project, which is a couple of decades old now, has failed. So I worry less about Taiwan. I think that's the Washington political class and the punditry class who wants to get us worked up that they're about to invade. I don't think that that's about to happen. So I don't think I can answer the question about Japan because I'm still challenging the assumption about what's going to happen to Taiwan. I think we make that situation worse by the things we're doing. For example, Mike Pompeo went to Taiwan twice, and in one of those visits said, we should just recognize Taiwan. The Taiwanese didn't want that. That gives them more problems than they need. But also, it's not a practical matter. If we recognize Taiwan, do they then join the United Nations, the General Assembly? Will other countries go with us? This is virtue signaling without a strategy. So I'm less worried about Taiwan than others. I'm more worried about our inability to get a China strategy than what the Chinese may do now in that part of the world.
So do us a favor and talk about France, Macron, and Germany, because they have just been a nightmare when it comes to the Ukraine issue. Because especially Germany, their policy for the last 20 years has been so pro-Russia, they just can't get out. And speaking of the 2% of the Defense Department issue, they pushed it off again. They announced it the other day.
Yeah.
But a friend of mine was at an event where the German Charles de Fer was talking about it, and he could not sidestep this issue every time I asked him, why aren't you helping Ukraine?
Yeah, so Germany and it was Don Rumsfeld who said, and at the time, Governor Wilson and I were on his defense policy board, and people laughed. He said, there's old Europe and there's new Europe. And I think the old Europe is losing out, and they've shown their hand. And so Germany and France, we can't fix them. But we've got a dozen countries in Central and Eastern Europe who want to partner with us, who are looking to us and are punching way above their weight. If the Germans and French put in 2% or better of GDP for defense, it would be a different Europe. But they're not going to do it. They don't have to do it. We can't make them do it. I think in the German case, it's a special problem because of World War II and because of Hitler. And we have to ask ourselves, how strong do we really want Germany to be? And they ask themselves, how strong do we want to be? My sense is that the trauma of war was so much more profound on them than we've ever been willing to accept. And, we are an island, a big island surrounded by big oceans that keep us out of some of the worst of world politics, or at least we've been able to do it. They were at the center of world politics. And I tell my students, I really feel that we're still living in the shadow of World War I. Not World War II, but the Great War, because that was the bloodiest war in world history to that point. Of course, World War II was even worse. But so many people believed around the world in the idea of the nation state, of the Westphalian Project, and then the war happened. And I think the beginning of the American progressive movement comes out of World War I, where people said, this doesn't work, so we need a League of Nations. We need something, we need to have collective governance. We have to abandon all of the things that nation states do. And you see a lot of that in Europe. What's the solution for them? War is always around the corner. And for them, because they're so close as nations, it affects their borders. They lose life very quickly. And I think in the case of Germans, not to be completely sympathetic, but there's a larger conversation about who they've been and what they could be. And that may contribute some to their, defense problem, which there is one. The Russia issue is very different, like Nord Stream 2. That's a longer conversation, I think. But I worry about the Germans. And remember, we kind of occupied them permanently. And the Japanese, nowhere else. South Korea, but in a different way. And we've been needed there. I think we've played a really productive role to help bring out the better natures in those two nations that were once empires.
Oh,
Yes.
Yes.
Does energy have anything to do with France and Germany's position regarding Ukraine? I suspect it does.
Well, I think so, of course. But had the Biden administration said, continue to say no to Nord Stream 2, I don't think the Russians would have done what they've done. Now the Germans and the French are facing the real reality of what it means to be energy independent from Russia and more energy dependent on the United States. So there's an interesting twist to all of this.
And winter is arriving.
Yes, and so, they're facing real challenges of storage for energy. Some countries don't have storage facilities in Europe, some do. How much can be stockpiled? There are really big issues that they should have been addressing a long time ago. Russia made it easier. Now, with the EU's decision not to purchase oil imports from Russia, the Germans or French are going to pay.
Yeah. Now, you have not mentioned Turkey in all of this.
Mm-hmm.
Where does Turkey figure into all of this these world problems? They seem to be right in the center of the centerpiece there.
So the Turks, to me, are like the Indians. They are hard to figure out. They go their own way, and they occasionally do good things. They helped broker the deal to get Ukrainian grain out of the region. That was, doesn't forgive all their sins, but they played a big role in it. Turkey's a member of NATO. And so, we have to, and they engage with Russia in selling weapons. The Trump administration could not stop it. I felt 20 years ago that if Turkey had been admitted to the EU, it would be a different Turkey. Maybe I'm wrong. The Germans were really against it at the time. I remember going to Germany and talking about this. They just couldn't see a pathway for it. But I said, admit the Turks now. In world politics, there are a few nations that are strategically located. And if you don't keep them moving north and west, it's a disaster. Turkey's one. They're just uniquely located where they can move north and west or south and east. Mexico's another. It can move north and west, or it can go south and east. And so I think Turkey and Mexico are unique, but Turkey and India are the countries to watch. And the ones that completely baffle us, but at least we have Turkey and NATO, and so we have some influence there. But the Turks do under Erdogan what Erdogan wants them to do. He's a leader for life.
So closer to home, you mentioned Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
So can you comment on the cartels and our relationship with Mexico?
Not much. That's a really difficult problem. I think it's worse now. And I think the Biden administration has made it worse. Not everything they've done, I think, has been completely wrong, but this one is wrong. And I think when VPOTUS Harris went to the region and talked about women and girls and climate change and those issues, it played into the hands of the cartels, and that's how I think most people feel. There is no border security policy in this administration. There is a move afoot to have Mayorkas indicted or impeached once the House is controlled by the Republicans for this very fact. I don't know that I'm for that, but I do get the sentiment. There isn't a border security policy. Trump had one, and the wall scared the hell out of everybody. And it just didn't get completed. There wasn't enough time. But the cartels are going strong, and I do think Washington plays a role. And I do think the politics of Washington are central to all of this. And that is why the vice president wants to stay away. I would stay away. Once she saw what was going on, it is in her interest, if she has electoral ambitions, to stay away, so she stays away. Yes, Pepperdine graduate student.
Hi, thank you. So moving south from Mexico, during your speech you mentioned that you're, I might be remembering this incorrectly, but you're looking for key leaders in South America who could, help represent the West. I spent some time living in Argentina. It made me a free marketer. I love the country, but I'm just kind of curious who you see those key players are in South America and why.
I think Guatemala, maybe Argentina, maybe Colombia, maybe Costa Rica, which, tries to stay out of it all. It's kind of the Switzerland of the region. Maybe the Dominican Republic, not many. It's a handful. And most are maybes, but they're even super maybes because there's not, I think you have to problem identify first to get toward a solution. And the big problem in the region is democratically elected socialist regimes. And so you won't get to those leaders if you don't believe that is a problem. If you believe that's not a problem, then there is no reason to talk to the Argentinians or those countries that are kind of on the fence.
Give me two things that the Biden administration has done correctly. Just two.
Yeah. Well, one thing I can say under Donald Trump, and again, he's a character, but I do think the big systemic changes happen under characters as presidents. We weren't in a new war. And that was really important. And we were, even though his instincts were to move out of Syria fast, get out of every conflict in the Middle East, it slowed down. Our departure got more careful, our deliberations got a lot more careful. Two things, that's the hardest question. Anyone's asked me in a long time, even harder than my students, that the Biden administration has done right. I think it's been such a disaster on so many fronts. I can't think of two things that it's done right on the foreign policy front. I think if there's one thing, I think it's commitment to the Quad. And expanding it to the leaders level. And second, this agreement of the UK, Australia, and the US on building nuclear subs for the Australians as a counter to China, ignoring France and Germany, saying we're going forward, you're out of the deal. I think that that's another example. I think the successes are in the Indo-Pacific. That's where I think it's had some success, and actually nowhere else.
Excuse me, another Trump presidency, how would everything change?
Will there be?
I don't know that there will be another Trump presidency. I think there's learning. There will be some learning, but I do wonder when you get to Trump's age, what's the capacity for learning? And the learning that you would need to, I mean, it's an unusual level of learning. And is any individual at his stage of life capable of a complete redo? I don't know. But I think that there will be the personnel problem will be fixed. There were two big problems in the Trump presidency. There were the personnel problems of the people the never-Trumpers who were picked, many of whom now are running for office, who used their jobs as a launching pad for their future career. No president can survive and do well when cabinet officials have two daytime jobs, one working for him. It's a longer conversation. And running for office, more than one. And the international personnel problem. Because we were all so new and had been out of office a long time, Obama 8 years, and I think we didn't have the international partnerships and relationships that you need day one. We didn't know who's who. We didn't know who we could trust. So we couldn't trust each other in the administration, and then we couldn't trust those abroad that we had to work with. It is amazing that we did what we did, given the personnel problem that was incredibly severe. The personnel problem produced a very specific policy problem, and that is most of the cabinet and sub-cabinet and mid-level officials who were political appointees did not believe that it was their job to turn the president's hunches and instincts into hypotheses. They thought they knew better. And when you have a government being run by people who think they know better, most of whom have never run for office, haven't been vetted by the American people, you end up getting impeached. And I think that's part of the context of what happened. It was the severe personnel problem.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.